And for the first time in 3 years, the China-Australia high-level dialogue is being held in Beijing, a sign of thawing ties. Australian Prime Minister Albanese confirmed a China visit later this year. It is the first Australian leader to visit since 2016. Sun Ye has more.
The seventh meeting of the China-Australia high-level dialogue was held in Beijing on Thursday, 3 years since the last time it met. The talks come as bilateral relations in the areas of diplomacy, defense, education, and other areas have warmed and improved, reflecting what's been described as good momentum, which China's former Foreign Affairs Minister says both sides should treasure and nurture.
We should treasure the mutually beneficial relations that we have now. The essence of China-Australia relations is mutual benefit and win-win cooperation. Treating China as a threat is a strategic misjudgment. China's development goal is natural rejuvenation and to do a good job at its own affairs, not to surpass or replace anyone. China's development needs a peaceful environment, and China's development will also contribute to the peace and stability of the world. We have never threatened Australia in the past and will not do so in the future. This kind of mutually beneficial relationship is worth cherishing.
Li says a healthy, robust relationship is in the interest of both nations and their people. He also invited attending delegates from the political, commercial, academic, and cultural sectors to pool their wisdom to maintain that good momentum.
As a former trade minister, I know how important Australia and China are to each other as economic partners. Our complementarity of our economies has brought great benefit to both our peoples over the years. I welcome the recent positive developments in the bilateral relationship, but we know that there is more work to do.
Chinese experts say with attendees, including former ministers from both Labour and Liberal parties in Australia, the Australian delegation reflects the country's bipartisan efforts to promote trade and economic ties with China, as well as people-to-people exchanges. Sun Ye, CGTN, Beijing.
For more about the Chinese economy, we're joined by Dan Wang, who is in Shanghai. She's the Chief Economist for Hang Seng Bank. Good to see you and welcome to the show. There's a lot going on this year in China. We had high expectations. Now we kind of reduced our expectations. We had the COVID. Now we don't have the COVID. What are international investors, perhaps, what should they expect from China?
Well, the international investors originally had high hopes for China's reopening and recovery. But as time goes by, the weakness in domestic and foreign demand start to show. And now there is actually a relatively high negative attitude towards China's fundamentals, which I think is mainly an overcorrection of the overly optimistic about China's economic outlook in the beginning of the year. And now we have seen that trade data is ticking up, but property remains relatively weak. And for the policy response, that's probably the major concern for all people abroad and home. Because so far, the policy response is quite insufficient and usually lagging, because there is a clear trade-off between the short-term concerns and long-term growth.
In years past, it's always been China's reliant upon exports, say, to America or to Europe or the rest of the world. But over the past decade or so, there's been a real movement, if not from Beijing, to promote domestic consumption, right? Because ultimately, you want to be self-sufficient. And I wonder, there's always talk of the slowdown in the U.S. or in Europe. But the truth is that for China, do they really need the rest of the world to be growing? I mean, they could be flat and China might be okay, no?
The rest of the world is important to China. It had been very important as sources of capital and technology. And in the future, it's going to be extremely important for domestic manufacturers because they need new market. And as far as the domestic economy is concerned, the urbanization is reaching a peak, and we have seen the fertility rate going down. It might bounce back a little bit, but aging has become a real problem for the domestic economy. As you have mentioned, consumption has been an area that the government is trying to promote, but is ultimately constrained by income growth. So for many of the domestic producers, they're aiming to go overseas. especially for those along the new energy supply chain, like the battery makers, auto parts makers. They're aiming to set up new factories in Europe, Latin America. So it is a new market for China.
Which then what concerns me is this 9% drop in exports, where, I mean, that's a fairly sizable number. How much blame is there between what's happening with the U.S. and China in terms of the, I don't want to call it a trade war, but disagreements?
There's really not much to do with the bilateral tension between U.S. and China, because clearly we see this shift of the trade pattern from mainly east-west to north-south. And for China's direct trade to the U.S., certainly the ratio has declined in the past 4 or 5 years. But if we count all those stuff that China exports to ASEAN countries, to Latin America, then those trade ultimately are still aiming for the Americans. So I don't think that trade decline is mainly due to the tension, but it's mainly due to the economic slowdown in the U.S. economy.
And circling back to my original point of what investors want, and I'm sure you're getting asked by clients the same question as well, is they've made some moves on the perimeter, for example, of reducing down payments and reducing on the margins home interest rates, specifically in China. And a lot of people say, well, it's not enough. It's not enough. But I never hear what needs to be done. Maybe you can help me. And what do you think Beijing should do, if anything, to stimulate the economy?
Well, there's a big difference between what's desirable and what's possible. And from economic perspective, of course, I think it will be the easiest if the policymakers allow housing price to fall as freely, more freely than what we have now. But as far as the wealth is concerned, it's not a realistic option, because for Chinese households, 80% of their wealth stored in housing. So there is a concern, even if the housing sector is going down, the policymakers will not let it have a free fall. So now we're a little bit in this limbo state, that the government is trying to marginally easing the purchasing restrictions. But since the housing price is still very high, people have very little incentive to buy new homes. So I'm curious to see what new policies are coming out, but whatever is on the table now is not working.
I always think that patience and time will solve things. I guess we'll see. The last thing I want to ask you is there's been a lot of talk of the new phone from Huawei. There's also some news and controversy regarding Apple. I just want to get your take on what's next for Huawei, and if you've seen the phone and sort of where do we go from here?
This is clearly a reflection of the competition between U.S. and China. And there's a great deal of policy support and also backing of the state funding to this kind of research and development. And I believe China's innovation will certainly improve, but without international collaboration, especially with the U.S. scientists, it's going to be relatively slow and it's going to be difficult. So this Huawei new phone shows the innovative capacity of China, but it also shows how much China has to invest to have one breakthrough like this. So in the future, the improvement between the bilateral relations is still the foundation for China to have any sort of breakthrough for its transformative technologies.
Dan Wang in Shanghai, Chief Economist at Hang Seng Bank. Really appreciate your analysis on this, joining us from Shanghai. Thank you.
Thank you.